pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters vanish from an ordinary home in Colorado. Their husband returns, calls the police, and within hours he is standing in front of television cameras, asking his wife and children to come home. He looks worried. He begs for their safe return. Millions of people watch him and believe exactly what he wants them to believe. But inside the investigation, something doesn't add up. Because the man standing in front of the cameras, asking for his family to come home, was hiding a secret that would turn a missing person investigation into one of America's most disturbing family murder cases. This is the story of Chris Watts. Before August of 2018, the Watts family looked like countless other young American families. Chris and Shanann Watts lived in Frederick, Colorado, in a quiet suburban development built for people just like them. They had 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, 4 and 3 years old. Shanann was pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy she had already named Nico. She documented much of their life online: family, trips, school mornings, small domestic routines, the kind of digital footprint that made this family feel familiar to strangers long before anyone knew their names. For a darker reason, Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Shanann sold health and wellness products. On the surface, their life had structure. Underneath it, according to what investigators would later piece together, the marriage was under strain. Financial pressure had been building for months. The couple had fallen behind on mortgage payments. Around the same period, Shanann traveled to North Carolina for business, leaving Chris alone with the children for an extended stretch. Investigators would later learn that during this time, Chris began a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. Shanann, according to those close to her, believed the couple was working to repair their marriage. Chris, investigators concluded, was already imagining a different life. That contradiction, one spouse trying to rebuild, the other quietly planning to leave, sits at the center of everything that followed. On August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from her business trip in the early hours of the morning. Chris picked her up from the airport. Hours later, he left for work. By mid-morning, Shanann had stopped responding to messages. The girls did not show up where they were expected. A friend, growing increasingly uneasy, went to the house to check on her. No one answered. That single unanswered knock became the first thread in an investigation that would soon unravel one of the most closely watched cases in recent American history. Police arrived at the Watts home that afternoon. At this point, it was still officially a missing person case. A young mother and 2 children who had seemingly disappeared. Without explanation, Chris cooperated. He spoke with officers, and then he did something that would later be replayed thousands of times. He stood outside his own house, in front of local news cameras, and asked Shanann to bring the girls home. At the time, the public saw a frightened husband. What they did not see was that investigators were already beginning to notice inconsistencies, small at first, then harder to ignore, between what Chris was telling them and what the evidence was starting to suggest. As the search expanded, so did the investigation. Detectives from local police worked alongside the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, treating the case with an intensity usually reserved for far larger jurisdictions. They began requesting surveillance footage from homes and businesses near the Watts property, hoping to reconstruct a timeline of that morning. That footage became one of the most important pieces of the entire case. It showed Chris's work truck that morning, and it showed him loading items into it before driving away. Behavior investigators found difficult to reconcile with his account of a peaceful, uneventful morning before Shanann's disappearance. Investigators were careful about what conclusions they drew from a video alone, but, combined with other details emerging around the same time, it shifted the entire direction of the case. The question was no longer only, where is this family? It had become what actually happened inside that house. Chris agreed to a police interview and a polygraph examination. He answered questions about his wife, his daughters, and his whereabouts. A polygraph is not proof on its own. Investigators have always treated it as one tool among many, but the examination became part of a longer, more intense process of pressing Chris on inconsistencies in his story. And then his story began to change. In an interrogation that has since become central to how this case is understood, Chris initially told investigators that Shanann herself had harmed their daughters and that he had reacted violently against her after discovering what she had done. This was his account, not an established fact, and investigators did not accept it. As they continued to confront him with what they had already gathered, his version of events collapsed further. Eventually, Chris admitted that he had killed Shanann. For the families and communities who had spent days hoping for a rescue, this was the moment the case transformed completely. A missing person search had become a homicide investigation, and the man who had pleaded publicly for his family's return was now the primary suspect in their deaths. The final and most devastating discovery came shortly afterward, when investigators located the bodies. Shanann had been buried on the property of the Anadarko Petroleum site where Chris worked. Bella and Celeste were found submerged in oil production tanks at the same location. The details of how they were found were never treated lightly by investigators, and this documentary will not dwell on them beyond what is necessary to understand the scope of what happened. What matters is that the mystery of where are they had a final, unbearable answer, and the case now turned toward a different question entirely. Why? Prosecutors and investigators, in building their case, pointed toward a combination of pressures: a marriage that had quietly failed, a new relationship Chris wanted to pursue, financial strain the couple was struggling to manage, and a pregnancy that meant walking away cleanly was not an option he believed he had. None of this was ever presented as an excuse. Understanding the pressures that surrounded a crime is not the same as justifying it, and the prosecution was clear that Chris Watts made deliberate choices that morning. Reconstructing the timeline, investigators established that Shanann arrived home in the early hours, that the family was together briefly inside the house, and that sometime before Chris left for work, he killed Shanann and their daughters. He then drove to his workplace, disposed of their bodies at the oil site, and returned home to begin behaving as though nothing had happened, culminating in his public appeal to the cameras just hours later. The case against him was built from multiple overlapping sources: the surveillance footage from that morning, phone records, the shifting versions of his own story, and ultimately his confession. No single piece of evidence closed the case on its own. It was the convergence of all of it. Chris Watts was arrested and charged, and the story became national news almost immediately, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the jarring gap between the man the public had seen crying on television and the man investigators now said had committed the murders. Rather than proceed to a full jury trial, Chris Watts pleaded guilty. He entered guilty pleas to 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. In November 2018, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with additional years in prison. He will spend the rest of his life incarcerated. In the years since, the case has remained part of the public conversation through documentaries, interviews, books, and endless discussion online. That continued attention says something about how disturbing the contrast at the center of this case still feels. A husband who asked the world for help and turned out to be the person responsible for what he claimed to be searching for. Looking back at the early days of this case, the warning signs are easier to see than they were at the time. The financial pressure, the unraveling marriage, the new relationship, the strange behavior on the morning of August 13th, the surveillance footage that didn't match his story. None of these details meant anything on their own. It was only once investigators understood what had actually happened that these fragments formed a clear and devastating picture. That is what should stay with you. Not the man who stood in front of the cameras, but the people he stood there pretending to search for. Shanann, who believed she was fighting to save her marriage. Bella and Celeste, 4 and 3 years old, and the unborn son, who never had the chance to be born at all. Behind the headlines and the footage and the trial, this was a real family, and their loss was permanent. For a few hours, America watched a husband ask the world to help bring his family home. But behind the cameras, investigators were already following a trail of evidence that would reveal the truth. The search for a missing family became a murder investigation, and the man asking for help became the man responsible.